Welcome back, and we are off to Chapter 8 of my series. And in this chapter, I'm going to finish discussing one more section of Section 1401. And of course, if you've been following my series, I've been going into great detail about this section in the previous two chapters. And then from there, I'm going to talk about one more section, Section 1402, that closely ties into Section 1401. So let's first start off with finishing up with Section 1401. If you go to Section 1401, page 118 of the Act, and more particularly subsection C thereof, titled Study on Affordable Coverage. And again, you're going to see this shortly on your screen. So if you pause this series and actually take a second to look at what it is that I've put up, many of you are going to wonder why I'm including this section as something to even look at to begin with. I've brought this to everyone's attention because, as usual, the government's going to take too much time in figuring out what a costly mistake this whole thing is. If the government takes 5 years to submit a report about how badly this act is working, by then, my guess is it's going to be too late. Many middle-class Americans will have taken other ways to either opt out of the act, pay the fines, or go broke themselves. Meanwhile, this act, which is supposed to be called affordable, will continue to skyrocket with costs that cannot be controlled. So that's the main reason why I brought this section up. Now, what's interesting is I love how timing works sometimes. The day I recorded this, it's September 21st, and last night on the news, before I went to bed, I caught an interesting tidbit on the news, which was the fact that the CBO recently discovered that their figures were off in terms of how many Americans are going to end up just willing to pay the fines instead of purchasing this health care. Originally, they had estimated that 4 million Americans at the time that this act is fully put into place are probably going to just go ahead and pay the fines. Well, now that figure's jumped up by 2 million more. So right now we're at 6 million right off the bat in terms of knowing that that's how many people who are automatically just going to pay the fines. And of course, one of the reasons why this is the case is because our economy is doing so awful right now. We have a very slow growth in the economy, a lot of people are hurting, and so they're just not going to be able to purchase into these exchanges. And that's the whole point of why I've been discussing these last couple of sections. Middle-class America is really going to continue to hurt because they won't qualify for subsidies, and then on top of which, the insurance is just going to be too far out of their reach. So I think it's interesting. Of course, it's great for the government because now they're going to end up getting in more revenue because people will be paying these fines to pay for the act itself. But I think it really defeats the whole purpose of this, which was originally going to be giving every American the right to have really good health insurance at an affordable cost. And I don't know about you, but so far I'm just not seeing that. Alright, so lastly, I wanted to discuss Section 1402. And this has to do with reduced cost sharing for individuals enrolling in qualified health plans. That's the title of it. And if you go to page 119 of the Act, and again, more particularly, subsection C, this is an important section because it sets forth how much your subsidy is going to be worth. And again, I'll bring up this subsection shortly on the screen so you can take a look at it. And of course, how much your subsidy is worth is how much of a reduction you're going to get off of your premiums. So you really are going to want to pay careful attention to your income levels, your family size, and your poverty levels. This is why it is so critical for all families to look up what their poverty level is to determine how this actually affects you, as I discussed in Chapter 7. Family size is also important. If your family is one of 3, meaning you only have 3 individuals in your family, again, for example, your poverty level at 400% means you can't make more than $76,360 a year. Now, for a family of 4 at 400% of the poverty level, it's right around $92,200. So for a middle-class sized family of 3, they're going to get penalized by more than likely having to pay for all of their own insurance premiums because they may be on the 400% poverty level. And a family of 4 or more, even though they have 1 or more persons to insure, which by the way, as I see it, is a longer term cost, the family of 4 or more will get more breaks. So does this mean that families of 3 should start getting busy and procreate so that they can be treated fairly as well under this act? When I say that, it just sounds absurd, correct? So what is it that I am saying? I am saying that this formula continues to be unfair all the way around. A family of 4 gets to make more, which is understandable, but a family of 3 has 1 less person to insure. Should not the smaller families get something for that? Again, this is yet another problem that I find with this whole act. Now, here's what I would have done to make this formula work for everyone, if we had to have this in place in the first place. Number 1, how much you make in terms of your income would not be based off a modified or adjusted gross income. Instead, it would have been based off of what's called your taxable income. Okay, so that's defined on a federal 1040 income tax return form, and in most cases you can find it on line 43 of the form. This is an important number because the IRS uses this figure to determine what your taxes really should be after they've taken in consideration your deductions for yourselves and your dependents, and also any itemizations you might end up taking. What I don't understand is why the federal government didn't give that same courtesy when figuring out your income for purposes of this Health Care Act. It would have made a lot more sense and would have helped close a gigantic gap for the middle class families in this country. Number 2, I've said this before, the poverty level should have been at a much higher threshold. 400% is just not realistic. I think it should have been around 800%. And again, that combined with what I just said about what our incomes should be based off of would have closed a massive gap in this country among the middle class American families so that we all could have qualified for something in order to purchase insurance under these exchanges. And lastly, I really don't think families should be punished simply because they have fewer children. There should have been some kind of extra credit or some way of recalculating these figures so that people with fewer family members to insure, they would have gotten some kind of a break so that it would have all equaled out. After all, in the long term, as far as I can see, that makes more sense. In the real world, does it cost more to insure 3 people or 4? And yet those with smaller families are getting punished for this because we are not then able to make as much, and then we're way over our poverty line threshold to qualify for any subsidies. Now, it's possible that if they actually took my advice, which I don't think is going to happen, would be great if they did, but if they actually took my advice and readjusted what our income levels are based off of and increased what the poverty level threshold is, it's possible that we wouldn't really have to worry about how many family members because it would all equal itself out. So that would certainly be nice. Now, that's how I would have fixed the formula. Quite honestly, though, the real way I would have fixed this whole bloody thing is when it's all said and done, I would simply just repeal this mandate to have health insurance altogether. I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it again. My health and the health of my family is my business, not that of the United States government, especially when you look at the track record of how successful the federal government has been with other programs. How well do you think the IRS is running? Most of us would answer that the IRS is pretty overwhelming with rules and regulations that are not even relevant anymore and don't make a whole lot of sense. Okay? And how well do you think the IRS does with their processing of paperwork? Do you really think the federal government and the state governments are going to be any better trying to run our health insurance? And that's just one example. I'm sure many of us know of many other programs, both at the federal and state level, that are run horribly. And yet we're going to release our health insurance and put it in their hands. And I just think that it's a humongous mistake. All right, well, thank you for listening as always, and stay tuned for Chapter 9.